Was Queen Isabella of Castile a hero or a villain? After doing 4 episodes and hours of research on the subject, I find it very hard to assign her to only one of those categories. She was certainly a unique individual with enormous amounts of courage and resolution. She was someone who believed in taking personal risks and sacrificing for what she believed was right. She was someone who encouraged an educational flourishing in her kingdom and made sure that her daughters got the same education that royal sons received, which was virtually unheard of in her own time. And yet, she's also the queen under whose watch the Spanish Inquisition was initiated. Decisions that she made during her reign extinguished the vibrant, mixed, ethnic and religious culture that had made Spain so unique. Isabella was someone who believed that her religion was the only truth, and that others must be made to conform to it, by force if necessary. Now, this was hardly a unique belief in the 15th century, but this belief, in the hands of so capable and determined a ruler as Isabella, became something quite menacing. We began this series looking at the Iberian Peninsula before Isabella's reign, and it was a place where there were warring, small, aristocratic kingdoms. Castile was the largest of them, but it had a weak king before Isabella took over, and very strong, fractious, aristocratic families. It was also a place where Jews, Muslims, and Christians had lived very close together for centuries. When Isabella became Queen of Castile, together with her husband Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, they embarked on a mission to strengthen the crown. They laid the foundations of the modern state of Spain. However, they also interpreted their mission as bringing all of their subjects under the authority of the church and making them good Christians. And that proved to be a horribly destructive undertaking. In episode 3, we covered the decade-long war that Isabella and Ferdinand undertook to conquer the Muslim kingdom of Granada that lay to the south, in what we now call Spain. In episode 4, we looked at the Spanish Inquisition, which was also initiated during Isabella's rule. Under Isabella and Ferdinand, the country we now call Spain would become wealthy and more powerful than it ever had before, but it would also become a harsh and intolerant place. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 5 in a series on Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. You can catch all the other episodes anywhere you listen to audio, including Spotify, or you can get the illustrated video version on YouTube. The year 1492 is where our story today begins. This was a year that began in triumph. In the very first days of January, Isabella and Ferdinand rode victoriously through the streets of Granada. This ended the decade-long Reconquista, or Holy War, that they had been waging to eliminate Muslim-ruled territory in what is now Spain. From now on, all Muslims, or Moors, would be subjects of the Crown of Castile. Now, you may recall from episode 3 that one of the terms of surrender for the Moors in Granada was that they would be able to continue practicing their religion as they always had. And Muslims being Muslims was hardly new in the Kingdom of Castile, and certainly not in the Kingdom of Granada, which had been ruled by Muslims for centuries. So, part of the terms of their surrender to Isabella was that they would be allowed to continue doing what they had always done and what Muslims in her own territory were still doing. Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to this. And at that time, the number of Muslim subjects that they were then ruling over dramatically increased as all of Granada was folded in to the citizenry of Castile. But Isabella must have hoped that her new Muslim subjects would eventually convert to Christianity. And she sent missionaries deliberately into the former Kingdom of Granada to encourage this very thing. But after 7 years of evangelizing, the number of converts was very small, and Isabella's expectations had been sorely disappointed. Meanwhile, the Inquisition in Castile and Aragon had been raging for more than a decade at this point. And as you'll know from our previous episode, the Inquisition was initially targeted at Jewish converts to Christianity, these converso families, who, by their conversion, were no longer bound by the very discriminatory laws that prevented Jews from engaging in a number of trades and also prevented them from accessing more important positions, both at civic levels and within the royal court itself. And so there were a very large number of Jewish families that had, through coercion and practical necessity, over a period of time, beginning more than a century before the Inquisition arrived, these people had converted to Christianity. Now, a number of churchmen in Castile told Isabella that these Jewish Christians weren't real Christians, that they were crypto-Jews, people who had converted to Christianity on the outside, but persisted in practicing Judaism in secret and functioning as sort of double agents, people who appeared to be Christians like everybody else, but who in fact were something quite different. All of this despite an astonishing lack of evidence. In fact, for many of the Jewish Christian families in Spain, these conversos, by the time the Inquisition arrived, they had been converted for several generations, and Christianity was the only religion that they were conversant with. Furthermore, practicing Jewish families in Spain did not regard these Jewish Christians as Jews either. So the Inquisition was spurred on by this ongoing suspicion and resentment of people who were ethnically Jewish, but had the nerve to become economically and politically successful. So the Inquisition by 1492 had several years already of targeting these families, eliminating their wealth, and burning people alive. They'd done a very good job of destroying the converso class in Castile. And yet this wasn't enough for some people. In 1489, so 3 years before our story begins today, the Grand Inquisitor, Thomas de Torquemada, had arrested a number of conversos and 3 Jews. Using their usual methods of torture, imprisonment, and secrecy about the exact charges, over a period of many months, the inquisitors had managed to extract from these men confessions of actions that were diabolical and horrifying, almost too much to be believed. But what the inquisitors got these men to say was that as conversos and Jews, they had met together to conspire for the destruction of Christianity in Castile. And we're talking about a handful of men here. Very few, less than a dozen, but apparently they'd been meeting in this clandestine way with this plot. Furthermore, at some unspecified time on a particular Good Friday, the year wasn't necessarily identified, they had kidnapped a Christian boy. They had crucified him. They had removed his heart and then use that organ in some sort of sorcery or black magic ceremony, once again to attempt to destroy Christianity in Castile. So now it's not just conspiracy, but it's kidnapping, torture, and black magic, thrown in with that the torture and murder of a child. So a more horrifying set of accusations could scarcely be imagined. Now, these ludicrous claims tell us a lot more about the fantasies or perhaps an agenda that the inquisitors themselves harbored than they do about anything else. The fact is that, given enough time under torture, a person can be made to say just about anything. And, to make matters worse, no particular child was ever identified as this victim who'd been so horribly tortured and murdered. There was no child who was ever reported missing. The child wasn't named. No body was ever found, despite all the efforts of the torturers to extract these details. And that's because no child ever existed. And yet, with these confessions, the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada now had the evidence that he had been seeking for so long. You see, Torquemada had already been campaigning to Queen Isabella for the removal of all remaining Jews from Castile. As Inquisitor, he'd been targeting Jewish Christians, but he had expanded the scope of his animosity to include anybody of Jewish descent, whether Christian or Jewish. But Isabella hadn't been convinced. She didn't think this was necessary. But now, after having extracted the evidence of this diabolical plot, Torquemada had what he knew he needed. So what happened to these unfortunate conversos and Jews? Well, of course, they were tried by the Inquisition, and they were sentenced to be executed by being burned at the stake. Now, the Inquisition was in the habit of strongly urging people to convert to Christianity or to repent and seek the mercy of the church, to be reconciled with the church, even if they were already converts, as many of these conversos were. But to be reconciled with the church, repenting of their sins at the very last minute, thus vindicating what the Inquisition had done to them, saying that, yes, I was guilty of these things, yes, I repent. And if a person did those things, and in that way validated the Inquisition, they could have the mercy of being strangled just before they were burned alive. And for many people, this was preferable to the long and agonizing death that being burned alive at the stake would entail. So most of the victims in this particular plot did exactly that, and they were strangled at the last minute. But a Jewish man named Yuche Franco, who was in his middle age at the time, and his father, who was in his 80s, both of them practicing Jews, went to the stake denying the charges against them completely. They were not going to give the Inquisition the satisfaction of hearing them admit and validate what was being done to them. And so these two men were the victims of something so vindictive and horrifying. It wasn't enough that they were going to be burned at the stake alive. Their tormentors first heated up metal implements until they were white hot and tore at the living flesh of these two men before they were tied to the stake and roasted. Now, I don't know what further evidence you need of the malice that motivated these proceedings and the absolute hatred and the vindictiveness that was leveled at these men. But nevertheless, the Grand Inquisitor now had what he wanted, and with this evidence in hand, he renewed his campaign to get the Queen to do something even more drastic. Torquemada approached the Queen and asserted that Jewish people in Spain were ultimately enemies of the faith. Practicing Jewish people would forever put the future of Christianity in danger because they would always be seeking to reconvert converso families back to Judaism. They would always be seeking to undermine Christianity. And so the only way that Christianity could be safe would be to remove all Jewish people from the kingdom. The sight of Jews being Jewish was just too dangerous to be endured. And this is, of course, despite the fact that Jewish people were subject to very strict economic and political sanctions, that they lived under all kinds of very limiting laws, but it wasn't enough for Torquemada. And now, with his cooked-up case of black magic and the outrage of what had been done to this anonymous child, he now had enough to bend the Queen's will in the direction that he wanted it to go. Now, Jewish people had been living in Castile and the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. They had been citizens of these kingdoms. They had contributed, sometimes as scholars when that was a possibility. They had contributed skills. They were excellent in terms of finances and investment. In fact, the Queen and King relied quite heavily on the financial abilities of some of their Jewish and Jewish converso advisors. And yet all of this was going to come to an end. On March 31st, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed a decree that required all Jewish people to leave their kingdom within a period of 3 months. It became known as the Alhambra Decree because it was signed amongst the splashing fountains and arched hallways of the Alhambra itself, that stunning mosque which remained a monument to Muslim presence and culture in the Iberian Peninsula. The number of practicing Jewish citizens of Castile in the kingdom at the time is estimated by historians at between 200 and 300,000 people. Now, prominent Jews came to plead with the queen to reconsider the expulsion decree. They offered her large sums of money. The idea that everybody would lose their homes, that they would be exiled, thrown out with very short notice, would be ruinous. And this was obvious to anyone who looked. So a delegation of prominent Jewish citizens came before the queen, and they made this case, pleading with her to reconsider this merciless decree. Now, legend has it that Thomas de Torquemada, who, in addition to being the Grand Inquisitor, was also one of the Queen's confessors, was lurking behind a curtain or a door somewhere, eavesdropping on this. And perhaps the Queen seemed to waver in her determination, and at that point Torquemada burst into the audience chamber where this conversation was going on and railed at the Queen, saying that if she were to agree to this offer, to these Jewish citizens who were offering her money, that she would be as guilty of betrayal as Judas Iscariot was, betraying Jesus Christ for pieces of silver. So he equates any mercy on this score with a betrayal of Christ himself. And this was sufficient to stiffen the Queen's spine. And from that point on, she turned a deaf ear to the pleas of her Jewish citizens, and the decree of expulsion remained in place. The text of the decree of expulsion read as follows: "We, having had much deliberation upon it, resolve to order all said Jews and Jewesses out of our kingdoms, that they never return nor come back to any of them. We command all Jews and Jewesses of whatever age they may be, who live and reside and are in the said kingdoms and seigneuries, natives and non-natives alike, who by whatever manner or whatever reason may have come or are to be found in them, that by the end of July of the present year, that they leave said kingdoms with their sons and daughters, male and female servants and Jewish domestics, both great and small, or whatever age they may be, and that they dare not return unto them, nor be in them, nor be in any part of them, neither as dwellers, nor as travelers, nor in any other manner whatsoever, upon punishment that if they do not thus perform and comply with this, and are to be found in our said kingdoms, and have come here in any manner, they incur the penalty of death and confiscation of all their belongings for our treasury. And such penalties they shall incur by the very deed itself, without trial, sentence, or declaration." In addition to sentencing any Jewish person found in the kingdom to death after the 3-month period, the decree had some additional clauses. Jewish people who were going to have to be leaving Castile at this point could not take their wealth with them in the form of currency or jewels. So if you were a wealthy person, you couldn't carry cash out of the country, which placed a drastic limit on the amount of resources you could take with you. And that was the whole point. So it wasn't just that you had very little time to take yourself and your family out of the country to some uncertain future, but you were going to be going with a fraction of whatever resources you had amassed in your lifetime. Now, try and put yourself in the position of someone that this decree is directed against. You've been given 12 weeks to leave the country, which is the only home you and your family have ever known. You're not allowed to take any currency out of the country with you. So what are you going to take resources in the form of? Carpets? Donkeys? It's going to put a really difficult limit on the amount of wealth that you can move with you. So the upshot is you're not going to be taking much. And where are you going to go? The countries that were neighboring Castile at this time were also not very friendly to Jewish exiles. And we're going to see the detail of that in just a moment. And if you're not out in this very limited amount of time, you're going to die. The desperation, the agony that this would create is very difficult to imagine. But this was what was done to Jewish citizens in Isabella's kingdom. So these people were faced with three choices: stay and die, go into exile in poverty and uncertainty, or convert. And conversion to Christianity was exactly what Isabella was hoping for. That was one of the reasons why there were these rules about not taking wealth out of the country with you, because Isabella didn't want her Jewish citizens to leave. That wasn't really the goal. She wanted them to convert. She wanted them to assimilate. She wanted them to become good Christian citizens of the crown. That was the ultimate goal here. But the majority of Spain's Jewish population decided to leave. Some sources say that a remnant, possibly as many as 100,000, opted to convert. And this would allow them to keep their homes, their property, and their jobs. And so these would be the latest wave of conversos, or Jewish Christian converts. But most of the Jews in Spain at the time decided to leave. And the name given to these Jews who were exiled from Spain is Sephardim. They are the Sephardic Jews. This is the origin of that name. This exodus was the greatest diaspora or scattering of Jewish people since their exile from Jerusalem under the Romans in the year 70 CE. Now, Portugal was the nearest country that many exiles would be tempted to go into, but it was very unfriendly to Jewish exiles. The King of Portugal said that anyone who landed in his country fleeing from Castile could stay there for about 8 months, and then they would have to move on. He made an exception for approximately 600 very wealthy families that he would allow to settle permanently in his country for a price. But for the rest, these Jewish refugees had to pay an entry tax to Portugal of 2,900 maravedis, it's a currency we're no longer familiar with, but think of it as the wage that's equivalent to 1 year's salary for a doctor. So these are people who are fleeing their country, not able to take currency with them, but as refugees, if they're going to enter Portugal, they have to pay this tax that's equivalent to a year's wage for a doctor. Imagine the impact that was going to make on whatever resources they'd been able to take with them. France and England closed their doors to these exiles, having banished their own Jewish communities in the preceding centuries. Italy and Germany also had very anti-Semitic attitudes and were extremely unwelcoming to these desperate exiles. In stories that are echoed by events in the 20th century, at this time, there are many accounts of Jewish people who were stuck on ships, leaving Castile, and sailing around desperately, not being able to land anywhere, not being permitted to disembark. In some cases, unscrupulous ship's captains just divested them of any of their remaining possessions and dumped them on the nearest shore. There are accounts of some captains who kept them very, very long at sea so that they could sell them food and drink at a ridiculously inflated price, thus fleecing these people or forcibly removing from them any remaining money that they had. Some were sold as slaves, and of course, the women on these ships were abused in all the ways that you can imagine. In the haste to leave Castile, there are also horrific stories that show the ruination economically of these Jewish families. So their Christian neighbors knew that they couldn't take their cash with them, and so many of these families are forced to trade an entire house for a donkey to make the journey, or to sell a vineyard at 1/10 of its market value, because they have a very short time in which they can make these deals. Everybody in the kingdom knows that, and so other people capitalize on the desperation and the situation that these families are in to take from them all the property and whatever resources they've amassed in this horrific situation. So for many Jewish exiles, after having left the country, being robbed of whatever remaining possessions they could take with them, which weren't many to start with, being abused, suffering in refugee camps for months at a time, eventually broken and ruined, a large number of them decide to return to Castile, saying that conversion is a price they're willing to pay for being able to return to the only home they've ever known. But of course, when these people do return, even though the law and Isabella would officially permit this because that was what she wanted in the first place, they had to deal with resentful neighbors, people who had taken their property who didn't want to see them back. You see, Isabella made a law that allowed returning Jewish people who were going to convert to Christianity to buy back their properties at whatever price they'd sold them for. But Christian neighbors who'd gotten large houses at a steal of a price weren't quite so willing to reverse the clock on that. And so for many of these people who returned with nothing, who'd been abused and broken and completely demoralized, they then had to return to communities that already hated them and didn't want to see them back and endure further cycles of violence and intimidation. Many of these Jewish refugees ended up in Muslim North Africa, so places like Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya. And an even larger number ended up in the Ottoman Empire, which was going to be the longest-lasting Muslim empire ever known and was centered in Istanbul, in Turkey. In fact, the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, not only officially welcomed Jewish refugees into his empire, he actually sent ships off the coast of Spain to pick up some of these desperate Jewish refugees. He ordered his provincial governors to welcome and protect these newcomers, and the Sultan's humanity would be rewarded. Many of the Jews who landed in the Ottoman Empire were merchants and artisans, and they brought these skill sets with them to their new home. One of those skill sets was war technology. Sephardic Jews taught the Ottoman Turks how to make artillery, cannonballs, and arquebuses. The arquebus is a precursor to the modern rifle. It was a type of firearm. These technologies increased the effectiveness of Ottoman troops in battle. These Jews, skilled in metalwork and war technology, had been creating these things for the Spanish, for the Castilians. But having been rudely ejected, they now provided the same technology and skills to the Ottomans. Another Spanish refugee became the personal physician to the Ottoman Sultan himself, and his son inherited the position of royal doctor when he died. Others served as trusted diplomats on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, opening up valuable trade routes with other Christian kingdoms. And these Jewish ambassadors were often seen as preferable, as more trustworthy than perhaps an Ottoman. And so they opened doors to Italy. They expanded the trade reach of the Ottoman Empire as well. Sultan Bayezid II is said to have remarked that he couldn't understand why anyone would think the King of Spain was a wise man when he had undertaken an action that caused so much skill and knowledge to flow out of his kingdom and into the Ottoman Empire. It's ironic to note that a desire to cleanse Spain of its Jewish and eventually Muslim populations ended up strengthening the most powerful Muslim empire in the world at the time. And what about the Muslims of Spain? The desire for religious purity that had motivated Isabella and Ferdinand's actions up to this point would have a very long shadow for them as well. Muslims, as I said earlier, already lived in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon as a minority group, and they had to pay special taxes, but they were otherwise allowed to practice their religion. When Ferdinand and Isabella had conquered Muslim-ruled Granada, another kingdom in itself in the south, they had enfolded a much larger number of Muslims into their subjects, and as part of the terms of that surrender, the same rules applied, that these people were promised they could continue practicing their faith. But the king and queen were about to change their position on Islam dramatically. They initially hoped that the citizens of formerly Muslim Granada would convert to Christianity voluntarily, and Queen Isabella had outfitted all of their cities with churches where there were bells and crosses, and they could witness Christian ceremonies being performed, and they could hear Christian preaching. She'd actually sent her converso confessor, a Jewish convert to Christianity named Hernando de Talavera, as the head of a mission specifically to the Kingdom of Granada. And so he brought with him a staff of friars to evangelize, and many of them learned Arabic. They spoke to the citizens of that kingdom in their own languages, and they tried to convince them to convert to Christianity. However, after 7 years, progress was quite minimal, as many Moors were uninterested in becoming Christians. And one reason for that might be some of the advice that Hernando de Talavera himself gave them. And I'm going to quote it for you. "In order that your conversion does not upset born Christians, and so that they do not suspect that you still hold the Mohammedan sect in your hearts, it is advisable that you imitate the customs of good and honest Christians in their habits of dress, shaving, eating, preparing the table and cooked foods, making them the same way, and in the manner you walk, give, and take things, and above all, in the way you talk, abandoning as far as possible the Arabic language, making it a forgotten thing." One of Isabella's biographers, Gilles Tremblay, points out that this advice from Talavera was probably given with the best of intentions. As a Jewish convert to Christianity himself, he was all too keenly aware of the horrible suspicion that many Jewish Christians had been subject to from their Christian neighbors. And that was what had started the Inquisition, with all of the persecution that had been inflicted on Jewish converts to Christianity. And so it was probably from the best place that he offered this advice to saying, basically, you need to become carbon copies of your Christian neighbors. It's not enough that you just take their faith, but in absolutely everything, in your appearances, in how you eat, in how you dress, and all of these things, you need to become indistinguishable from them. But the most difficult part of this would have been the language, because that was an erasure of an entire culture. It was an erasure of their history, of their literature, of their scriptures, of their traditions. And many of the Moorish inhabitants of Granada were understandably not interested in seeing all parts of their identity erased in this way. By 1499, after 7 years of evangelizing with very minimal success, Isabella sent another man, Cardinal Francisco Cisneros, who was a much more hardcore and hostile figure than Hernando de Talavera, who'd been someone who believed that gentleness and persuasion was the only way to undertake conversion. Cisneros was a man who believed that force and violence could legitimately be used to obtain converts to Christianity, and that is exactly what he unleashed on the citizens of Granada. His arrival saw a campaign to force conversions through torture and imprisonment. And of course, this was obviously a violation of the terms of their surrender only 7 years before. This is now 1499, and they had surrendered in 1492. So the memory of those terms was quite fresh, and here all those promises of the crown had been overturned as Cisneros was given a free hand to do whatever was necessary to obtain conversions. So this prompted outrage and even a violent campaign of resistance. People took up weapons and said, "We're not going to tolerate this. We never agreed to this. This is a betrayal." Now, the rebellion was put down, but the fact that there had been an armed rebellion was then used by the monarchs as an excuse to formally erase or reverse all those promises of religious toleration that they had made in 1492. Of course, this was a reversal that was formal only, because in practice they'd already reversed them, but they used that to simply correct the written record at this point. And it was only 3 years later, in 1502, that Cisneros was behind another royal decree that outlawed Islam. So not only were people being forced to convert to Christianity, but it then became a crime to be Muslim at all. After officially outlawing Muslim religion in Granada in 1502, this same Cardinal Cisneros became the next Grand Inquisitor in 1507. So he inherits the position after Torquemada is done. And in that new position as Inquisitor, seeing as there aren't very many Jewish Christian families anymore left to chase, he turns the attention of the Inquisition to Moriscos, or Muslim converts to Christianity, investigating the authenticity and the sincerity of this new faith that has been forced upon them. It's under his watch that being a Muslim becomes illegal not just in Granada, but also in the entire kingdom of Castile and also Aragon, where Muslims had been for centuries. Unsurprisingly, this policy, pursued over several decades, led to more armed resistance. And in 1566, after Ferdinand and Isabella are no longer ruling, there's another king of Spain, Philip II, he has to deal with armed uprisings that are the fruit of these repressive policies. The culmination of all this horror was that it wasn't just the religion of Islam that was expelled, but finally the people themselves. All people of Moorish descent were expelled from the Kingdom of Granada in 1571 and from the rest of Spain by 1614. So again, those expulsions of Moorish citizens are happening after the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. But those expulsions are merely an extension of the policies that they had initiated. Both the Inquisition itself, the expulsion decree of 1492 that removed all Jewish subjects from the kingdom, and then the religious repression of Muslims and making the practice of Islam itself illegal. So these policies continue to extend into the future and ultimately result in eliminating all of these people themselves from the territories that they had resided in for centuries. The Jews of the Iberian Peninsula called it Sepharad. It was a place where they had been able to thrive, even though there had been periods of repression over the centuries, and where they had made great contributions to scholarship and to culture. The Muslims called it Al-Andalus, and they filled it with the scent of saffron, the taste of almonds and honey, and with the beautiful arches and fountains that echoed dreams of North Africa from whence they had originally come, giving the culture and the architecture of that peninsula its distinctive character and a beauty that nowhere else in Europe could lay claim to. These versions of Spain, beloved by their communities, were lost forever. The Christians called it Toda España, and it was their religion and their ideas that drove out all others and gave it the name of Spain, by which we know it today. Now, in 1492, at the same time that Isabella and Ferdinand were heavily involved in this campaign of religious purity, they were also being petitioned by a certain sailor whose name you all know. Christopher Columbus, an Italian from Genoa, was looking for a patron. He was convinced that an Atlantic route to Asia was possible, bypassing the Mediterranean trade routes that were increasingly controlled by the powerful Muslim Ottoman Empire. In North America, we've all heard Columbus's name because his story leads into ours. But the issues that preoccupied Ferdinand and Isabella, these ideas of religious purity and civilizational conflict between Christianity and Islam, are not included in that story because we think of them as old world issues. But the two are not so easily separated. Christopher Columbus framed his appeal for royal sponsorship to Isabella as a chance to Christianize India and the Spice Lands, and to fortify them against the spread of Islam. He actually pitched this mission as an extension of the Christianizing ideals that the Queen clearly already espoused, and that were at the heart of all of her actions as a monarch. So Columbus knew the audience that he was framing his appeal to, and he deliberately included these religious elements as part of the appeal. He also claimed that securing a Western trade route to Asia would enable Europe to mount another crusade to scoot around and retake Jerusalem from the back, as it were, reclaiming Jerusalem and the Holy Lands from Muslim control. So there are these sort of crusading elements, even, that he weaves into his pitch. So even as Columbus is framing his mission of discovery, he's using these ideas of conflict, of religious supremacy, and of crusade that are already preoccupying much of Europe and have for a number of centuries. He was also convinced, of course, that there would be gold, lots of gold, and that he would bring this wealth to Castile. And it would be inaccurate for me to leave you with the impression that Isabella's interest in this was only religious. If anything, she was a very shrewd monarch, and she understood finances. And this was something that would have been important to her as well. So Columbus offers the queen both things. He offers her the promise of incredible wealth for a relatively small investment. And he also appeals to her ideals and to her sort of elevated sense of herself and her mission as well. Columbus was a very persistent man. He didn't just emerge and get an audience with Isabella in 1492 and receive her consent. He'd been campaigning to get her support and funding, the very significant amount of funding that would be required for his expedition since about 1485, 1486. And he'd been hanging around in Castile for 7 years, trying to get audiences with the queen, a chance to repropose his ideas and to reignite her interest. But in 1485 and onwards, Isabella was in the middle of the Reconquista. She was very heavily committed financially to this extremely expensive decade-long war. So she wasn't willing to hazard any other funding for a speculative expedition, which might or might not have returns. And so she sort of expressed some interest. She said that she would have his proposals reviewed by a committee of scholars and experts. And they did review Columbus's claims and, his ideas about how long he thought the distance would be. And the fact is, Columbus believed that the distance he'd have to cross on the ocean was actually much shorter than it was truly going to be. So they thought that some of his measurements were off. They thought that some of his claims were dubious, but perhaps they were also put off by some of the demands that Columbus was making as part of his proposal. You see, he wanted funding from the crown, but in exchange for his expedition services, he wanted to be promised a number of very elevated aristocratic titles. So these were very grand Castilian aristocratic titles that would normally only have been given to someone who was an aristocrat. And Columbus was a nobody. He was a sailor from Genoa. He was an Italian. He wasn't even Castilian. And yet he wanted to be promised that he would have the title of admiral and also viceroy, and also that he would be the governor of any lands or colonies that he discovered, and that position of governor would be passed on to his sons as a hereditary thing. So he was seeking aristocratic prestige, and he was also seeking a permanent position with economic security that would be quite elevated. So Columbus goes back and forth. He makes friends at court. He tries to have advocates pitch his cause to the queen's ear. He does so himself in person whenever he possibly can. And he's been doing this for about 7 years. And finally, in 1492, he gets another audience with the queen, and he makes his pitch, and she sends him packing. She says, "Thank you very much. Not today. I don't think we're going to be in the business of putting these funds out there." And so Columbus gets on his horse, and he starts riding towards the border. And he must have been incredibly discouraged after trying so hard for so long. And he's already thinking about who's the next monarch that he's going to approach, probably the King of Portugal, who already has a demonstrated interest and investment in exploration. So he's already moving on to his next plan, but he must have been incredibly frustrated at the apparent waste of time. But then a strange thing happened. It had only been about 2 hours since Columbus had left the Queen and been on the road when he's overtaken by a royal messenger on horseback who tells him the Queen has changed her mind. Return at once. You're going to get an audience, and she's prepared to sign a contract. We don't know for sure what it was that caused Isabella to change her mind in such a short period of time, but we do know that it was a complete 180. She reversed her position. She was willing to sign a deal with Columbus, give him all the titles that he'd requested, and supply funding for this expedition. Now, it might have been that she was aware and worried about neighboring Portugal's existing investment in exploration, and the fact that Portugal had already established trade routes and new colonies that they were extracting wealth from. So she might have had a second thought and said to herself, the cost of this investment is relatively small compared to the potential gain, and the cost of not doing anything could be enormous because we can watch our neighbor, Portugal, get rich while we ourselves sit here having changed nothing. So that might have been the thing that tipped the lever, but whatever it was, this decision she was going to make would have monumental effects. Of course, even after the papers had been signed, the expedition couldn't commence immediately. The 3 ships that Ferdinand and Isabella had promised to supply to Columbus had to be supplied, they had to be provisioned, they had to be filled with experienced crew members, and also the funding had to be cobbled together. The king and queen didn't just have the entire amount that was going to be required for this sitting in the royal coffers. The deal that was drawn up involved Columbus himself having to front a certain percentage of the money, which he had to get from a moneylender or financial backers. The crown supplied a certain percentage, and then other investors also supplied funding for the expedition. So it wasn't as simple as just Isabella saying yes and supplying the entire amount. This was a big deal. And this age of exploration that is being embarked on at this moment is one that requires financial backing and cooperation from a number of parties for any of these expeditions to happen. They're so expensive that no single party can afford to support the entire thing. By August the 3rd of 1492, Columbus and his 3 little ships were on their way. Where Columbus first made landfall is something that historians talk about, and there's not an enormous degree of certainty, but many of them think that it was probably the island of San Salvador on the eastern side of the Bahamas. He would also visit the islands of Hispaniola and Cuba. But because Columbus was sailing in search of the Indies, the spice lands, and he thought he had found them, he termed the native people he found there Indians, a term which persisted for many, many years after the man himself, but it's because of his own misjudgment of where he'd landed. In his letters back to the Queen, Columbus reported the native people were kind, gentle, and without much skill in weapons. He thought that they could very easily be converted into a ready labor force, that they could be Christianized, but also, more importantly to him, put to work tilling fields and building cities after the custom of Castile, and that they would be the new subjects of Her Most Catholic Majesty Isabella. However, the gold that Columbus had promised, which he was convinced would be readily available in large supplies, was nowhere to be found. And after making these promises, Columbus felt under a lot of pressure to prove that his mission of exploration was going to be financially profitable. And because he searched increasingly desperately for gold and didn't find much of it, he began to think that one way of making the account books square would be to monetize the population by enslaving them. And in 1493, he returns to Castile with a number of souvenirs from his voyage. He returns with parrots and sweet potatoes and other sorts of objects to demonstrate what was found in these new lands, but he also returns with a number of natives that he's basically kidnapped, and he has them on display, and he's hoping to show that these people can be a source of revenue. His claim is that the new lands could supply as many slaves as could be desired. So even if there was no gold, look, there's lots of economic value that we can still extract. Now, Isabella and Ferdinand were thrilled to welcome Columbus with all of his souvenirs and these colorful birds and his many stories. And they were very eager to supply a second, much larger expedition of 17 ships to extend his exploration. This second expedition would have a far larger accompaniment of royal staff. Some of them would be there to tabulate the resources that the crown could count as its own, and others, a certain number of friars or churchmen, would also be supplied with a mission of evangelizing the natives. Isabella specifically directed Columbus and his staff to treat the natives, quote, well and lovingly, without upsetting them in any way. This reveals a fundamental difference toward native people that Columbus had and the Queen had. They did not share the same idea. Columbus was willing to see native people as just a source of economic revenue, people who could be forced to work or who could be removed from their islands and sold as slaves elsewhere. Isabella was not willing to see the inhabitants of the New World as slaves. Now, you might find this surprising if you listen to episode 3, in which Isabella and Ferdinand presided over the enslaving of an entire city population in Malaga during their Reconquista campaign. But that episode of slavery, cruel though it was not the MO that they normally followed. And Isabella might have argued that it was necessary to enslave the population of Malaga at that time for 2 reasons. One, there had been a very long, very expensive siege that had cost the crown enormously, and they needed to discourage other Muslim cities from resisting so long and so expensively. And so by making a terrifying example of the population of one city, it would not be necessary to do such things again because other cities would quickly fold rather than risk suffering the same fate. So she might have made the argument that was a cruel but strategic choice. And the other one would be even more pragmatic. The fact was that at times, the royal coffers were bare during that campaign, that they struggled to have enough funding to continue. And so it might have been simple economic desperation that required quick capital to be extracted at that time from Malaga, and slavery was the most ready way of doing it. But in the case of the New World, Isabella is not willing to resort to this at all. She says that the natives of the New World were not people that had committed any offenses or that she considered herself to be at war with. And so she repeatedly instructs Columbus that these are people who need to be educated, treated with kindness, treated with gentleness. And she does, of course, hope that they too will convert to Christianity eventually, but she's not at all willing to simply use them as a form of economic capital. This difference in views between the Queen and Christopher Columbus reflects a debate that was going on in Christian Europe at the time regarding who could and who could not be a slave. Now, you might recall that taking slaves as a form of war booty had been going on since the Greeks and Romans and even long before them, back to the time of the Babylonians and the Assyrians. I mean, taking slaves in war was nothing new. But the idea of expanding slavery and voyages that would involve trading in humans and goods purely for a form of profit was something that was becoming increasingly common during this burgeoning age of exploration. And the Portuguese were already doing it. They'd already sailed to West Africa, and they were taking slaves and bringing them back and selling them. So the distinction that some people in Europe made was that anyone who was a Muslim, a pagan, an idolater, or a cannibal could be made a slave. Basically, anyone who had their own religion or did things that were disapproved of by Christians. This category is one we might call enemies of God. And so if a person could be put into that category, then they could be sold as a slave for profit, whether you were making war or not. This was sort of the new consensus. And this could apply even if you were just engaged in violent resistance to the actions of colonizers or explorers. It wasn't even necessary that you had objectionable practices independently, but the mere act of taking up arms against some of these people could get you classified as one of these enemies of God and subject to slavery. However, if a person was already a Christian, or, in the more expansive version, had the potential to be a Christian, then that person should not be enslaved. Now, various popes had already weighed in on this matter. There were some differences of opinion. The Portuguese were willing to classify any Black people they found in West Africa as just automatically enemies of God, category 1, potential slaves, no consideration required. But Isabella was much more inclined to view people in the New World as category 2, as potential converts, people who didn't have their own existing religions or any kind of posture or position that was at odds with Christianity. And this might have been just due to ignorance on her part and Columbus's part, not observing the existing cultures and religions that were doubtless already in place. But be that as it may, Isabella viewed these people as potential Christians, and she didn't approve of Columbus's desire to just enslave them en masse. However, soon, because he wasn't able to send gold, Columbus persisted in sending natives back to Castile whom he claimed were cannibals. Now, some of them initially might have been, but soon he was sending other people who were guilty only of violent resistance against the rape and the theft that Columbus and his men were inflicting on their communities. His views and the ideas of those who followed him were to treat the people in the New World much as the inhabitants of West Africa were being treated, as enemies of God who could be dealt with through violence and slavery. The story of the Spanish influence in the New World is a vast topic, and certainly not one that we can cover in this episode. But it was Isabella's last-minute change of heart when she called Columbus back and decided to back his expedition that would decide the fate of millions of people. Because of this, it was Spain that colonized most of South America and the West Indies, rather than Portugal or some other European country. This decision began the building of Spain's overseas colonial empire, something that would elevate Spain to a position of greater wealth and power in Europe than it had ever had in the century that would follow. In the long term, it also meant that millions of people in the New World would speak Spanish and convert to Christianity. But it also involved slavery on a massive scale and the destruction of native peoples and their way of life. In reflecting on Isabella herself, I'm going to leave you with a quote by Patrick Wyman, a historian who's written an excellent book called The Verge, dealing with Isabella, the Age of Discovery, and a lot of the financial changes that made the modern world possible. And he says of Isabella this: "For Isabella, princess and later queen of Castile, prayer was a statement of her agency, and provided a victory wrested from fortune by patience and fortitude. She grew to adulthood surrounded by men who intended to use her for their own political purposes. In the end, she bent them all, Enrique IV, her eventual husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, popes, and innumerable lesser figures alike, to her will. In an age of immensely capable and ruthless rulers who built increasingly powerful states everywhere, from England and France to Castile and Hungary, the most talented and accomplished among them was this one unlikely queen." 1492 is a year that was a landmark in Isabella's reign. It was her long-sought victory over the Muslim-ruled kingdom of Granada. The decade-long war which ended in this conquest was something she saw as the will of God, and as a vindication of her own sense of her mission as a monarch and her role in the world. The same year, she expelled all practicing Jews from her kingdom, leading to death and ruination for thousands of people. These actions were done in the name of protecting religious purity in her domains, and in defense of a vision of a new state and a more powerful monarch whose ideals of rule and of religion would apply very heavily to all who found themselves subjects under them. These actions would change Castile forever and forge the nation of Spain that we know today. Finally, 1492 is also the year that she said yes to Columbus and his voyage, a voyage which would open the door to unknown lands and change the face of the world. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Villains and Virgins podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to audio or also on YouTube, and consider sharing it with someone else that you think would enjoy the stories. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on another episode very soon.